Honorable Judge David Wolf presiding. All ye have business with this court, draw nigh, and ye shall be heard. God bless the United States, this state, and this court. You may be seated.
You all right? All right, good morning, everyone. Let me address a couple of things before we get started. First and foremost, we have one of our alternate jurors who is ill, and we are going to send her home. She is throwing up last night and again this morning, so we're going to just release her and send her home. She was one of the 4 alternates, so she's not one of the 12. And I've advised our jury of this fact, and I'm advising you. Throughout this trial, I've tried to make sure everyone had ready access to the courtroom and could be here if they wanted. But there are a lot of people who are coughing throughout this trial, and it's distracting to the jury. And for that reason, we're adopting a new policy. If you are coughing, you're required to wear a mask. If you do not wish to wear a mask and you're coughing, you'll be asked to leave. The bailiffs have been instructed to have masks available. You're not required to wear a mask, but if you start coughing, you're going to be asked to leave unless you're willing to wear a mask in the courtroom. I don't do this because of any mandate of anything. I'm doing it to try to preserve our ability to proceed without having issues that arise from the illness. One of the jurors has bronchitis, and she's advised me that she may be coughing, and I'm not requiring her to wear a mask because of the simple fact that I've told them all they can wear a mask if they want, but they're not required to, and she's indicated that if she coughs, it'll be just her bronchitis. I only do this as a means of trying to protect everyone's health to the extent that we can. Probably should have done it from the day one, but we're going to adopt it from the next several days that we were here. So, the second thing.
You're still muted. Just for the record, can we get counsel to confirm on the record that they agreed to releasing the signature? Just for the record. That they agreed to releasing the signature. Anything else needs to be done?
Let me, for the record, just ask, is there any objection to me releasing this alternate juror who is ill?
No objection.
All right, let the record reflect that both sides have agreed that the old juror should be allowed to be released. Now, yesterday afternoon when we adjourned, there was an issue regarding Mr. Schaffer, who is a defense mitigation witness that testified. In that testimony, he volunteered in response to a question from Mr. Evans, his opinions regarding the correctness of the penalty of the death penalty, and I interrupted the proceedings to bring that to the attention and to voice my concerns over the fact that that was inappropriate testimony. Mr. Evans, after the jury left, argued that that was proper mitigation testimony, and what I would like to do is the following. I am citing from the State versus Hester, a case in which the defendant sought to submit the same category of information and mitigation. In that case, I happen to know that the trial judge, Alan Wallace, who was a personal friend of mine before he became judge and I practiced in front of when he was judge, was personally opposed to the death penalty. But nonetheless, as I did, he took an oath to enforce the laws of the state of Tennessee, and for that reason, he nonetheless enforced the death penalty statutes in the Hester case. In the State versus Hester, the defendant sought to submit the testimony in mitigation of one of the surviving victims. And that person was expressing an opinion about the correctness of the death penalty as a possible punishment. Judge Wallace interrupted that and excluded that testimony and did not allow her to testify that she did not believe in the death penalty and did not think that the defendant should be put to death. Essentially, Judge Wallace didn't allow the testimony for the following reasons. It invaded the province of the jury. The legislature has set out the definite procedure to reach the death penalty and does not include the opinion of anyone, lay or expert. That type of opinion testimony did not qualify as either an aggravating circumstance or a mitigating circumstance. The Court of Criminal Appeals agreed with Judge Wallace that such testimony was essentially irrelevant for the jury's determination of an appropriate sentence. That's citing the State versus Hester in the 2009 Westlaw 275760 at page 31. After noting the opinion of the Court of Criminal Appeals, the Tennessee Supreme Court went on to state the following. The Tennessee rules of evidence are too restrictive and unwieldy to be applied strictly in the area of capital sentencing. They're citing cases which I'll omit. Accordingly, the Tennessee rules of evidence should not be applied to preclude introduction of otherwise reliable evidence that is relevant to the issue of punishment as it relates to mitigating or aggravating circumstances, citing State v. Sims. Mr. Hester does not cite a single authority supporting his argument that a court must admit evidence that a surviving victim opposes the death penalty and therefore does not believe the defendant should be executed for the murder of another deceased victim. Nor does our review of the case law suggest that such testimony is required to be admitted. To the contrary, such testimony is considered to be irrelevant. And then I'm omitting the citations from the Supreme Court. And courts have consistently held that such testimony is inadmissible. Accordingly, we decline to find that the trial court abused its discretion by declining to permit Mr. Hester to testify about her, Mrs. Hester, to testify about her philosophical opposition to the death penalty or her opinion that Mr. Hester should not receive the death penalty. State v. Hester, 324 Southwest 3rd, page 1. The portions I've cited are at pages 58 through 60, Tennessee Supreme Court decision from 2010, which is, in my opinion, still the controlling and prevailing authority. In footnotes to that decision, the Supreme Court cites United States v. Brown, which states that a federal case which states the victim's family may neither testify as to believing the death penalty should be imposed nor that it should not. Robinson v. Maynard, another federal case, determining there is no support for the proposition that mitigation evidence is required to include testimony as to the opinion of the victim's family that the defendant should not receive the death penalty. Deutsch v. State, concluding that the trial court did not err by excluding testimony from the defendant's family as to their opinion the defendant should receive life in prison versus the death penalty. Green v. State, concluding that the victim's wife's opinion that the defendant should not receive the death penalty was admissible neither as mitigation evidence nor as victim impact testimony. It goes on, there's numerous cases that are cited that I will not take the time to cite. But the point of that is this is prevailing law. This is not a new question that has suddenly arisen before this court and that it's my interpretation that is controlling. I am applying the law of the state of Tennessee to this case as written from the last 11 years by our Tennessee Supreme Court. So it is not, in my opinion, proper mitigation evidence for the defense to offer that testimony from Mr. Schaffer. If Mr. Schaffer thought he was doing the right thing and trying to volunteer that, he will be instructed he's not to do so. And I intend to give this charge to the to the jury. And I want to read it for you so that you understand what I'm going to instruct the jury. Yesterday, before we adjourned for the day, this witness, Mr. Schaffer, testified concerning his opinion about the death penalty. This court has determined that such testimony is not appropriate testimony and should be stricken. I am therefore instructing you to disregard that portion of the witness's testimony and not to consider it. Furthermore, I want to make it clear, I'm instructing defense counsel to instruct every witness that they call from this point forward not to volunteer their opinion on the sentence they think the jury should impose. And I'm instructing defense counsel to reinforce with each witness before they testify this court's instructions. And I'm also instructing defense counsel not to ask questions that invite a witness to share their opinion about the appropriate punishment that they think the jury should impose in this case. Now, that is a direct order of the court. I know we've had some issues in the past about whether or not my orders are correct or whether or not they are interpreted according to other case law, but this is a direct order of the court, and I just want to make sure everybody's clear on the record that if we have another instance of this occurring, then the court will deal with it. I don't want to have to deal with it in front of the jury, and I will excuse the jury, but we are not going to have that type of testimony come into this court. I didn't allow Mrs. Baker to testify about her opinions and her requests regarding it. I'm not going to allow the defense to offer testimony that essentially does the same thing from the defendant's standpoint. Everyone clear about my ruling? All right, then we will take that matter up and I'll instruct the jury when they come back and we'll go from there. Anything then further before I bring the jury in?
For the record, the attorney's nodded their heads.
Mr. Evans?
Yes, Your Honor. And
For the record, just so we have a verbal response, the state understand my ruling on this issue?
Yes, sir.
Defense understand my ruling on this issue?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Two things. One, I wanted to make sure Your Honor went from the admonition or the admonition to the jury, and then started in with the order that the defense counsel shall. Those are two separate things. Just making
That is
sure.
correct.
Okay. 'Cause-
I'm not going to instruct the jury about what I'm instructing you.
Okay.
I'm
Yes,
just
sir.
going to, I wanted to make it clear, this is, I would like nothing better than to just open this to let everybody have their say about it. But I am doing everything I can to preserve your right, your client's right to a hearing under due process, but also to preserve this case where there's not a built-in question of appeal, and opening the door to allow both sides to introduce things that are clearly not admissible by the Supreme Court's decisions is what I'm trying to avoid, because all it does is create an issue for an appellate court to reverse what we're doing here. So that's my reasoning and why I'm doing this, Mr. Evans, and why I'm trying to make sure that this is an enforceable order. I only instruct the jury about that first portion, that I'm not going to, and we'll do that in front of Mr. Schaffer when he's back on the stand. So
Yes,
you
sir.
might want to talk to Mr. Schaffer if you need a moment to before he's recalled, to make sure he understands his limitations. So.
Absolutely, Your Honor. And I want to make clear, I did not ask, that was
I'm
not
sure.
responsive to my question that I asked.
Well, and that's why I phrased what my instructions are. Don't ask a question in an open-ended form that invites someone to make their opinion. And that's what I said yesterday, was the question that you ask is, do you understand what the jury's charged with doing? And it was like an open invitation to say, yeah, and then volunteer it. So this, I don't think the state will object, and I'm going to allow you to ask leading questions that are within the scope of what is allowable under mitigation, so that we don't have that happen again.
Yes, sir.
I understand you're not trying to invite error, but I think it's one of those situations we need to make sure that there's not, that the witnesses answer correctly. I did that with one of the state's witnesses, Mr. Hudnall, I think it was, allowed them to lead him, and I'll do the same for you in this stage.
Now, the second part of the argument we had last night, when Mr. Schaffer was still in the room before we adjourned, was the question that I was going to ask him was the second question. I didn't anticipate that response. It was really just to key up there.
Second question, state your second question again for me for the record, if you'll speak into that
Yes.
microphone.
So, second question that I intended to ask Mr. Schaffer, that I believe is an appropriate question, is if Mr. Wiggins were executed, what effect would it have on?
Question. My opinion is that that does not go to the effect of imposing a particular punishment. I didn't allow Mrs. Baker to testify about the effect that having a life sentence with the possibility of parole would have on her. Neither did I allow her to testify about what effect it would have if Mr. Wiggins was given life without parole. It goes to him expressing his opinion about the appropriate punishment, so he will not be allowed to testify about that. In my opinion, he can testify about his connections with the defendant, which he's done, his, the social interaction and so forth, and any good qualities that he thinks Mr. Wiggins has demonstrated, which he clearly has testified about. But beyond that, he is, for him to answer that question that you're proposing is essentially saying, it's going to have a really terrible effect on all of his family and friends if he's put to death, and that's a comment on the appropriate sentence, which I'm not going to allow.
I understand.
I'll note your objection and what
Thank
you're
you.
proposing, and if you want to make an offer of proof for the appellate record, I'll allow you to do that, but I'm not going to allow it before this jury.
Understood, and I would like to allow Mr. Schaffer to do that and a jury out to make an offer of proof.
So let's go ahead and bring him in, and let's do that now so that we can.
He needs to talk to him.
Would you like me to meet with him before we do the offer of
Yes.
proof?
It's not responding. There it goes. Just wait a minute.
Make sure that speaker is on. All right, for the purpose of an offer of proof, Mr. Evans, you may ask your questions.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Schaffer, appreciate you being here this morning. Again, if Stephen Wiggins were to be executed, what, if any, effect would that have on you?
I think it's going to crush me. I think it's going to be a horrible effect. It's going to devastate me and his son and his mother. It's going to create more victims, is what it's going to do, and a greater level. I mean, what you're doing is you're asking it to be a worst case scenario. I don't see how it is beneficial in whatsoever.
All right. Mr. Schaffer, you understand, and I think you were in the courtroom when I made my ruling earlier, and that you understand that relying on clearly established principles and instructions and precedent by our appellate courts, I'm telling you that you cannot volunteer your opinion regarding the correctness of the punishment to be issued in this case. Are you
Yes,
willing
sir.
to comply with that?
I do understand that,
All right.
yes.
Then with that, we'll bring the jury back. Bring the jury in. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You may notice that we are down one person. One of our jurors is ill, and we are, after consultation, we have decided to release her and let her go on back to her home, since she is apparently fairly significant. It's not anything, it may be a stomach upset type situation, but she is sick enough that we decided to let her go on home. So she is going to be transported back to Knoxville, but we're going to proceed with our remaining 3 alternates and the 12 of you. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday before we adjourned for the day, this witness testified, Mr. Schaffer testified concerning his opinion about the death penalty. This court has determined that such testimony is not appropriate and that that testimony should be stricken. Therefore, I'm instructing you to disregard that portion of the witness's testimony and not to consider it. All right, and with that, then the state, I believe, does Mr. Evans, do you have any other questions for this witness?
No, Your Honor.
All right, does the state have questions for this
Yes.
witness?
Good morning, Mr. Schaffer.
Good morning.
You doing all right this morning?
Yes, I am.
All right. Just have a few questions. In your testimony I believe you said not only do you know the defendant, but also his brother, Scotty?
Yes, I do.
Do you still know Scotty?
Yep,
He's still alive?
yep.
All right, thank you. You also testified when asked what it takes to be a plumber, and you said a lot.
It does.
That's pretty fair representation, a lot.
Yes.
Does it take a lot of skill, a lot of learning?
Yes, it does. It takes time.
And I think you also testified that when someone is first hired as a plumber, they learn by watching and observing.
Yep.
And when you first hired the defendant, did he learn by watching and observing?
Yes,
You testified that the defendant was good at what he does.
he is.
Did he become a good plumber?
He did.
It's fair to say that he could plumb an entire house.
Yeah, I believe he is pretty close to that. I'm not.
If he made a statement that he could plumb an entire house, would that be true?
I believe that. I believe he probably could, yes.
So he became skilled by not only working with you, but by observing you.
Yes.
Very capable of learning.
Yep.
You also testified that he was strong,
Yes.
coordinated,
Yep.
pretty athletic person.
Yep.
I think y'all testified about jumping off some bridges and
Yeah, yep.
swimming.
Yep.
He could do all of those things, no problem.
Yep.
He's capable of making quick decisions.
Yeah.
I would refer to them as executive decision-making abilities.
Sure.
Executive functioning.
He certainly had the confidence for it.
Mr. Evans, you have an objection?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right.
I think this witness is qualified to make a determination on executive function.
Sustain as to the phrasing of the question, you may rephrase it.
Well, I'll be more specific, Mr. Schaffer. Let's talk about when you had your heart attack in February of, 2013, February 27th, 2013.
Mm-hmm.
You were suffering from obviously some apparent ailment, is that right?
Heart attack.
And you had instructed the defendant to continue working. You wanted
Yes.
to finish the job. But he was able to observe that something was not correct or not right about you.
Yeah, I dropped in the box.
You dropped in the box. And he made, I guess when I say the executive decision, to take you to the hospital. Yeah?
Yeah, he carried me out of the box, yes.
Even though you wanted to stay and continue the job.
Yeah, I had him stay and continue the job. He
But
finished.
But he made a decision there on the spot to take action.
He was gonna, yeah, yep. He got a hold of me and got me out of the box.
Okay. Just a couple more questions. What was the cause of your heart attack?
Exhaustion.
Exhaustion?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was sitting there keeping the hose off of the wall, and the tractor was just moving so fast that to keep up with it for 300 feet.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really hard to do. And then after doing that, to actually try and lift the thing and turn it and put it into place, it was just too much. It was just exhaustion.
Any other factors contributing to your heart
Well,
disease?
probably, my bad habits, smoking and, drinking and eating bad food.
Had you been drinking the day before?
No,
No?
I don't think so.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Just want you to take a
Your Honor, may
second.
we approach?
On the record?
Yes, Your Honor.
Just lean on me.
Your Honor, I would object to his line of questioning. The cause of his heart attack is not relevant to his testimony. Whether he got it from drinking or bad habits or whatever else. Unless they're disputing he had a heart attack, why he got it. He's not qualified to diagnose why he got a heart attack. And whether he drank the next day is not relevant.
What are you offering? Ladies and gentlemen, step out if you will, please. All right, I'm going to allow the state to ask these questions and outside the presence of the jury, and then I would like to have the state give me the relevance as to what the questions present for this line of questioning.
Judge, the relevance in this case is to go to the witness's memory and his credibility.
What was the date of your heart attack?
I'm not sure, sir.
February 27th, 2013.
All right, February 27th of 2013. And what are you about to ask him about?
I'm going to ask him what occurred on February the 23rd of 2013.
All right, and that was that he was arrested for public intoxication.
Public intoxication and discharge of a firearm in a public roadway.
And how does that go to the issue of credibility?
Well, I asked him if he remembered what happened the day before his heart attack, and he said no. But I think he does remember. I mean, I was going to give him the opportunity to refresh his memory first.
And how does that go to credibility?
Well, anytime a witness, well, first, let me back up to last night. He sat here in this court and gave a very specific, detailed account of all the things he remembered about the defendant, but yet he doesn't remember this. So what is he holding back? What's he not saying to the court and to the jury? Why does he not remember this event but remembers all the events with the defendant? How could you not remember being arrested for discharging a firearm in a public roadway and being arrested for public intoxication, which, as he testified, his bad habits, including use of intoxicants, are what actually led to his heart attack?
And this event that you're referring to is on what day?
February the 23rd, 2013 at
4 days
2022
before
hours.
his heart attack.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Evans?
Absolutely not relevant, completely improper cross-examination. It's nothing to do with his credibility. He said, what were you, even his question was, what, you remember what you were doing the day before? This is the 23rd. I mean, if there was some argument that he was under the influence on the 27th, that it affected his ability to remember the events of the 27th, potentially. But that's not even what this suggests. They're trying to get in, improperly get in.
Actually, I was ruled that.
You need to be quiet, sir, while
I'm
we're discussing this issue. You just sit quietly until you're asked a question or instructed by the court to answer
Yes, sir.
something.
Your Honor, I mean, this has nothing to do with the questions he's asked. It's improper cross-examination. It does not go to his credibility at all. It's an improper way to try to backdoor in a pending case or a prior arrest from a witness. It has nothing to do with, it wouldn't be appropriate conviction to even put in if there was a conviction to this for discharging a firearm in this gun, or excuse me, this public intoxication. Your Honor, it shouldn't be allowed. And the cause of his heart attack is not relevant. And that's how we led into this. And he's not qualified to say how it happened.
Judge, I'll withdraw the question. We can just move on.
It would appear to me that asking a question regarding being arrested for discharging a firearm in public intoxication 4 days before the heart attack, even if he was drunk at that point, does not go to his credibility, and I don't think it would be appropriate. For that reason, I sustain the objection. States indicated they're going to withdraw the question anyway. Would bring the jury in, please. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your cooperation. I would just remind you that when I send you out of the courtroom, it's for me to consider something outside of your presence, and we have done so, and I would remind you your instructions are not to speculate or try to imagine or guess what takes place outside of your presence, but only base your decision upon the evidence that is admitted. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Schaffer, let me just finish up real quickly. So based on your testimony that you've given so far in direct examination and cross-examination, I have taken from that in order to be a good plumber, you have the ability to do some problem solving. Is that right? The
That's
defendant has
correct.
that ability too.
Yep.
You can solve problems. You can work under deadlines. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
He testified how you guys were under a deadline for the farmer installing
Yeah,
this. So-
wanted to get it done for him, yes.
and in those situations, you have to adapt on the fly. And the defendant, he could problem solve, is that right?
Yep.
He could work under deadlines, work under pressure,
Yep.
and adapt on the fly.
Yep.
Thank you.
Redirect.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Schaffer. You may step down and you are released from further testimony. You are free to leave or you may stay.
Thank you.
Defense may call your next witness.
Your Honor, we would call Dr. Andrew Newberg.
Stand right here, face clear, raise your right hand, be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give in this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Let's see if this chair speak directly into the microphone. Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Newberg. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good morning.
Wonderful. If you don't mind, please state your full name for the benefit of the jury and spell your last name.
Yes, it's Dr. Andrew Newberg, N-E-W-B-E-R-G.
And Dr. Newberg, what do you do for a living?
I'm a physician, a nuclear medicine physician at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia.
And how long have you been a nuclear medicine physician?
About 20 years.
And tell me a little bit, or tell the jury rather, a little bit about your education.
Sure. So I attended the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and then I did a residency in internal medicine, like general medicine, at the Graduate Hospital in Philadelphia, and then I did a fellowship in nuclear medicine, which is the subspecialty of radiology, to see how we can understand the function of the body and the brain by using different kinds of imaging equipment. And so I trained in nuclear medicine for about 2 years after that, and then I worked at the University of Pennsylvania for about 10 years, and then moved over to Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. So I'm a Philadelphia person, born and bred, basically.
And I mean, what's a typical day for someone who specializes in nuclear medicine?
Mostly it's about reading scans, talking to patients. We try to help people with a lot of different issues and problems. Some of the imaging is about the body. We might do a scan of the kidneys or the heart. And a lot of my work has been primarily looking at the human brain and helping people who have different issues, different problems with the brain. It could be an older person who has Alzheimer's disease. It could be somebody with depression. It could be somebody who has had a concussion and has persistent symptoms. And a lot of times they're struggling to understand what's going on and trying to understand what's happening in their brain. And by doing specific types of scans to help us look at the function of the brain, not just the structure of what's there, but what it's actually doing there, it gives us an opportunity to, one, help them to kind of tie together what's going on symptomatically with what's going on in their brain, and then hopefully we can help them understand the diagnosis and the physiology of what's happening in their brain as well.
I'm going to hand you a copy of your curriculum vitae.
Thank you.
Do you recognize that to be your curriculum vitae?
Yes, I do.
And it says here faculty appointments, so does that mean that you're a professor as well?
Yes.
And How long have you been a professor?
I've been a professor for about 10 years, a full professor.
And doing that, are you also working as a clinician as well?
Yes, so my day-to-day job is working both clinically to work with patients and look at their scans and help them figure out what's going on. I also do a lot of research, so we're doing research studies, again, primarily looking at the brain in a variety of different disorders like Alzheimer's and depression, multiple sclerosis, concussion, and so forth.
And have you ever been qualified as an expert before and testified in a court?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And Your Honor, I would move to have Dr. Newberg qualified as an expert in PET imaging and nuclear medicine.
Any objection? All right, he will be qualified as such an expert. And have you made his CV an exhibit? Is that what you're about to do?
Getting ready to do that.
What would the next exhibit number be?
266.
266.
Oh, sure.
So, Dr. Newberg, at some point were you contacted and asked to engage on behalf of Mr. Wiggins to look at some PET scans?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about what you were asked to do specifically.
So I was asked to take a look at the PET scan for Mr. Wiggins. Typically that involves sending me a digital copy of the scan, and to analyze it using the methods that I typically have done for our research studies for our clinical patients as well. That basically involves taking a look at the scan visually, inspecting it to make sure it looks okay, that there aren't any problems with it in terms of artifacts or other issues, and then putting it through a quantitative analysis software program, which is an FDA-approved software program that takes a look at a whole bunch of different regions of the brain, actually approximately 70 different regions of the brain, and helps to assess whether or not those areas of the brain appear to be functioning normally, are overactive or underactive, and then assess what those areas are, and also try to get a better sense as to whether there is a diagnosis, something that we can help to understand what's been going on with this particular person's brain, with Mr. Wiggins' brain.
And when you say two things. One, when you say metabolic activity, what does that mean in reference to the brain?
So when we look at the brain, there's a couple of different ways of using imaging to explore the brain. A lot of people are familiar with an MRI, which basically looks at the structure of the brain, just what's there. But that doesn't really tell you what's going on in the brain. And so what we typically do is a PET scan to do that kind of imaging. Typically, the nuclear medicine part of what I do, the nuclear part is that we inject a little bit of a radioactive tracer that follows some part of the brain's physiology. And in this case, it's basically a little bit of a radioactive sugar. So we label this radioactive sugar, it's injected into the body, and it gets taken up into the brain to show us where that sugar goes. And since our bodies use sugar for metabolic activity, for the cells to do the things that they do, it gives us a great picture of what's happening in the brain and how these different parts of the brain are working. So it gives us a real opportunity to see what the function of the brain is, and to be able to try to understand, based on the patterns of those functions, what's going on in the brain.
And why is it important when you say activity over 70 regions of the brain?
Well, we have lots of different parts of the brain, and so they all do different things. And so sometimes it's very helpful to be able to look at lots of different areas of the brain to see exactly where dysfunction might be. Sometimes people have issues with memory. Sometimes people have issues with their emotions. The brain, of course, is incredibly complex. So being able to look at all these different regions gives us an opportunity to understand all the different areas of the brain, how they're working, how they may be not working, and which areas of the brain might not be working together or working well together. And so it really gives us an opportunity to again, really look at the overall function of the brain itself.
And are you actually able to visualize on a PET scan how the brain is functioning?
Yes. So again, there's just the visual image that we get. So we actually are able to look at all the different slices of the brain, if you will. We kind of slice the brain in different ways to be able to look at where the activity is at each of those levels. And so sometimes we're looking at areas that are higher up in the brain, sometimes areas that are more central in what's called the cortex, the outer parts of the brain. This gives us an opportunity to look at all the different parts of the brain. So we do look at them, and I inspect them both visually and then have it go through the quantitative analysis so that it's not just my looking at a scan, but it's something that's very objective. It's actually designed to compare that person's scan to a normal database of individuals so that we can see whether or not they fall within the normal range or outside of that range.
And did you come to specific findings in reference to Mr. Wiggins?
Yes, I did.
And did you do a report that shows those findings?
I did.
I'm going to pass you a copy of your report. Tell me if you recognize that document.
Yes, I do.
And go ahead.
I was going to say, this is the report.
Your Honor, I'd move his report in as the next exhibit.
267.
Now, when you first got involved with Mr. Wiggins' case, what steps did you take to start trying to gain information that would put you in a place to be able to adequately come to a conclusion?
Well, a lot of it is just to look at the scan itself and to do the analyses. So that, to me, it's important that I try to do that initially just to see what's going on. The quantitative analysis is really just an automated process. So those numbers, those values are just the objective information that we have about the brain. But then once we have that information, it becomes helpful to understand what's going on with that individual. So it's relevant to understand their history. It's relevant to understand what various issues and problems that they're dealing with, cognitive issues, emotional issues. And with that in mind, I was provided the information about Mr. Wiggins' history and some of his neuropsychological evaluations so that I could get a better feel for what are the issues, what are the symptoms going on, and how that may be related to what we're seeing on the brain scan.
And when you say you were provided that information, did you review records?
Yes, I was able to review some of the various medical records.
And did you also have the benefit of reviewing other reports from Dr. Bigler?
Yes, I did.
Dr. Watson?
Yes.
Right. And did you, to your knowledge, did you review any other report? Dr. Karen, maybe?
I believe there's a report by Dr. Karen, too. Yes, correct.
And after reviewing all that information, especially the social history, what if anything, did you find of relevance as it related to Mr. Wiggins' brain function?
Well, there were a number of different areas in the brain that were abnormal, and some areas were overactive, some areas were underactive, and sometimes the analogy that I like to use is, thinking about your brain a little bit like a car engine, so that, you obviously you want it to be working normally. If it's overactive, it's like a car engine that's revving, but you have the brake on. And so the brain areas that are involved are trying to do something, but they're not able to do it. So if it's a cognitive area, for example, if it's an area involved in helping a person with thinking or paying attention to what's going on around them, if that area is overactive, then they're not able to do that properly. And then the other side is if a part of the brain is underactive, which is kind of like a 6-cylinder engine that's firing on 4 cylinders, and so it's just not working properly for the person. And similarly, if you have a situation like that, then that usually means that area of the brain and the functions that it does for you, it's not able to do that. So when we start to look at more specifically Mr. Wiggins' brain, there are a number of areas of the brain that were both underactive as well as overactive that I talk about in the report. So,
did you do slides? Did you do?
I made a few slides that just help to show that and summarize that.
And I'll hand you a copy of those.
Okay.
Those appear to be the slides that you.
Yes, these are the slides.
Your Honor, I'd like to have the slides PDF version marked as the next number exhibit.
Exhibit 268.
While we're getting through our technical difficulty, I'll just
looked like they were there for a moment.
Sorry, Dr. Newberg,
No,
bear
that's
with us
okay.
for a moment.
I deal with a lot of technology, and a lot of times it doesn't work for me either.
Yeah. Yes, sir. I think you can give it a whirl, see if that
Okay.
clicker works.
So I think one of the, part of it, when I think about what I'm seeing on a scan, I always think about talking to the person who has, whose scan it is, and trying to understand what's going on with them and trying to explain it to them. As I mentioned, there are areas of, here we go, of both increased as well as decreased activity. And actually, if I'm doing this right, let me start here. So this is this is the image of the scans. These are just a couple of selected slices. But one of the important things that I wanted to point out here on the image, is that before we even talk about the numbers, is where these arrows are pointing, it's all at the same place, it's just different angles of that area of the frontal lobe that was observed to be abnormal, not only functionally, but structurally as well, looking at the MRI. So I think Dr. Bigler in his report talked about this area of abnormality in the frontal lobe, which most likely, from my perspective as a physician, looks like a congenital abnormality. And that, when you look at these scans, things are flipped a little bit. So where that is looking at is in the right lower part of the frontal lobe. So it's kind of like right about here. And this part of what we're looking at is kind of an absence of brain tissue there. So that's very clear, even just seeing on the image. But part of what I was also able to discover by doing the quantitative analysis is that, and let me see if I can go back to that. So all of these areas that I've highlighted in yellow are areas that are decreased. And a number of areas, both on the left and the right, which are the two middle columns, more on the right where that particular abnormality is in that right frontal lobe. And so we see not just in the lower part of the frontal lobe, but many other parts of the frontal lobe as well. And I don't know if I actually have a pointer. I guess it doesn't show up. But a number of areas in the entire right frontal lobe seem to be abnormally low. And so, yeah.
Not to interrupt you, but
Yeah, sure.
with the court's permission, can he approach the screen?
No.
If you need to approach the screen to point,
Sure.
Dr. Newberg, feel free.
So these areas in particular here, some of them are part of the inferior frontal lobe, the lower part of the frontal lobe, but then there's other parts as well. So this even goes into the middle part and what's called the superior part, the upper part of the frontal lobe. So this area that seems to be abnormal in that one particular place seems to be extending the effect to other parts of the frontal lobe. And that's based on what we know about how the brain works, that when you have a certain area that seems to be involved, it's connected to a lot of other areas. And therefore, when there's an abnormality in one spot of one part of the brain, it can actually have a lot of effects elsewhere. So these are a number of different areas that have pretty significant decreases of activity. And not to continue to be a little bit technical here, but the numbers represent standard deviations. So this has to do with sort of the normal variation that we see in numbers. And if you have a standard deviation of around 2, that means that it's that only about 4 or 5% of people would be at that level. So that starts to become abnormal when we start to think about that. Means that it's only a few percent of people would have these levels of activity, either low or high. And so you can see a lot of these areas are kind of approaching or above where that level is. And that suggests that these are pretty substantial areas that are decreased. And then we start to think about what the frontal lobe can actually do. And I can go back. But the frontal lobe is very involved in helping us to focus our attention. It's important when we're trying to solve problems, helping to plan our day. It's what's called our executive functions. And it also helps to regulate our emotional processes. So we normally have this balance that's going on, that when we have a strong emotion, if somebody cuts us off on the freeway, we get very upset. But then it's our frontal lobe that can turn on and say, okay, we got to get to work, don't worry about that. If the frontal lobes are not working well, then we're not able to regulate those emotions as effectively as possible. And we see this a lot of times in people who do have emotional dysregulation, where they're not able to control their emotions properly. The frontal lobes are just not working very well. And then on top of that, we also see areas of decrease in another important area of the emotional parts of the brain, areas of the brain called the amygdala and the parahippocampus. These are in a very central area on the side of the brain, and these are part of what our emotional systems are what allows us to have our emotions. And so when people have abnormalities in these areas, that implies that they're going to have a lot of problems with how they express emotions, how they feel them, how they're able to deal with them. And again, when you have that combination then of areas of the emotional system of the brain being abnormal, as well as the controls, the frontal lobe being abnormal, then that's consistent with people and with someone who is not able to regulate emotions well.
Now, a couple of things. First, you talked about the MRI and what you call the structural abnormality of the brain, and you said there was an absence of brain tissue. I mean, is that correct? Essentially a hole?
Yes, I mean, it's basically, usually it's just like fluid, and so it's just like a hole in the brain. It's an area of the brain that is not there.
And obviously the PET and the MRI are different scans, correct?
Correct.
And when you actually looked at them together, well, first let me ask you this. At the time you reviewed the PET and did your analysis on the PET, had you seen the MRI yet?
I don't know if I actually had it originally, and I did notice that there were some abnormalities. I think that led me to ask, is there something going on in that frontal lobe that that I'm seeing on the PET, but I couldn't tell if there was something structurally there.
And so then, when you actually did get the MRI and reviewed it, was there anything remarkably similar?
Well, absolutely. So, ultimately, when you look at the brain, and then I was actually able to overlay the brain onto, with the software, you can overlay the brain onto the scans, the PET scan and the MRI scan. And so the area, there's that one particular area that is, a structurally abnormal that you can see, and they match up with an absence of metabolism in the brain. That's that hole that I was showing on the PET part. But then what happens is that beyond that, there's other areas that seem to be abnormal in the frontal lobes as well.
Now, you talked a little bit generally about these different areas of the brain. Can you put this more in terms of Stephen's brain specifically? I mean, what's it mean to have areas that are hyperactive? What would that mean for behavior?
Well, usually it means that you're not able to regulate your behaviors well. So when you have an inability to do that, that would mean that you can't control your behaviors. You can't control your behaviors in response to whatever emotions that you're feeling. Other areas of the brain that were also abnormal, a little bit more towards the back of the brain, are also involved in that were abnormal in Mr. Wiggins' brain is that are some of the social areas of the brain. So that would lead to the idea that a person is not able to kind of read social cues or be able to interact with a person appropriately socially. And then when we see this kind of abnormality, that supports that particular idea that not only is the person having problems with the ability to assess emotions both within themselves and within others, but they're not able to kind of respond appropriately as well in terms of the behaviors.
You said the word congenital abnormality. Could you explain that to the jury?
Sure. So this is an abnormality that essentially is present from birth. It is something that you're born with, and while we don't have a scan from when he was 6 years old to just show that it was there, the nature of these particular abnormalities is that it's something that's been there for a very, very long time, pretty much since birth.
And in your expertise, you can make that finding even if you don't have a scan from when he was 6 years old?
Correct.
And what's that based on?
It's based off of what that particular abnormality is and how it develops in a person's brain. So we don't typically just have this kind of absence of brain tissue there. It is a developmental abnormality that occurs.
The abnormalities that you've noted in Stephen's brain, could they be from drug abuse?
Well, there's a lot of different areas that are abnormal that we're finding. And so if you look at the literature and you look at what it says about people who have taken drugs and the kind of findings that you see in their brain, people who've used drugs for a long period of time, there may be one or two areas that could be related to that. But when we look at all of these different areas that are abnormally decreased, and then these are the areas that are abnormally increased, which again are a large number of different areas, I don't think it's possible to make that inference that the effect of different drugs would be causing that level of abnormality and in so many different regions. And in fact, when people have done some studies that have looked at, for example, long-term users of different drugs, usually the effects are ultimately relatively mild. And again, that's why I wanted to point out where these numbers are. These are, over 2 standard deviations, meaning that it's in the top, 2 or 3% in terms of the level of activity, that you typically don't see this when you're talking about people who have other kinds of drug effects. So I don't think that I don't think there's a way to explain this, all of these different findings in all these different areas, and areas that are both increased and decreased, simply by talking about a history of drug use.
And I would assume that you talked a little bit about, who does the scans. I mean, my wife is a nuclear medicine tech, so she actually injects people.
Right.
I would assume you don't actually go in and inject the isotope in the person to do the scan. Is that correct?
I have sometimes, but yes, usually it's a technologist who does the scans.
Okay. And can medication, any kind of prescription drug, can that affect the accuracy or the reliability of a PET scan?
So it's important to understand what's going on in terms of the person and what medications they may be taking. As a little bit of what I was saying a moment ago about other drugs, typically when you have a use of different medications like antidepressants or anti-seizure medications or something like that, there can be mild effects that tend to be somewhat global, but they don't affect a whole slew of different areas in lots of different ways and to this level. So if you look at the literature, usually it's affecting the brain maybe like 5% or 10%, but we're talking about effects here that are 20 to 30% basically. So they're part of the way this software works, and maybe this is another answer to your question, is that the regions that are considered to be abnormal have to meet a certain criteria. So if we know that there's normal variation. We know that what you're thinking about in the moment can slightly fluctuate your brain. If you're taking a medication, it can slightly fluctuate the brain. But that's usually all within a fairly narrow range of activity. But so when you're looking for abnormalities, you don't want to consider just mild changes to be abnormal. You want to be looking for areas that are pretty substantially out of the normal range. And that's how the software works. So it's not just taking kind of the normal variation that one might expect from a variety of different factors, but something that may be more permanently related to what's going on in the brain.
So do you have any reservations, concerns whatsoever about the accuracy of the PET scan that was performed for Mr. Wiggins?
No, I mean, I feel very confident in the findings.
And Dr. Bigler, based on everything you reviewed of Mr. Wiggins' brain, does Mr. Wiggins have a normal brain?
No, I think this is an abnormal brain.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
How are you today?
Okay.
I want to first start out by asking you to define normal brain. What is a normal? What do you consider normal?
So a normal brain would refer to an individual who, well, it has to do with the type of person that we're looking at and what other factors are going on to make them an otherwise healthy individual that doesn't have neurological conditions, for example, like Alzheimer's disease. And it's defined in our analysis here by the quantitative analysis that is looking at the range that is beyond, to get technical here, 1.65 standard deviations. So that means that there's going to be some normal variation. It's compared to a group of normal controls that was developed by this particular software, used by this particular software. So they kind of have what's normal for the software system based on approximately 40 individuals that don't have any issues or any problems. And then they compare each individual scan to that. So they look at your individual scan and they compare how many standard deviations above or below the norm this particular person's scan and the particular regions are.
And you said that's based on a database?
Yes.
Within the software?
Yes.
Is that correct? And so then, based on what you're saying, abnormal is something outside of this one standard deviation?
1.6, correct, yeah. Mhm.
Okay. And so that's a statistical a word, the normal. It's based on
Correct.
statistics, not on someone being intellectually disabled in some way. It's strictly statistical.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but we also, then I'm going to wind up looking at those different areas of the brain to see where they are, how they relate to what's going on with that particular person. And there are certain diagnostic patterns that we can look at. So, for example, we know that Alzheimer's disease affects certain areas of the brain. And so if those areas show up as abnormally low, then that may be indicative of a person who has Alzheimer's disease as one example.
Okay. Now, I'm going to go through your report, and I have some other questions for you. But
Sure.
The history section at the top, it says the patient is a 33-year-old male with a history of impaired cognitive function and possible diagnoses of ADHD and schizophrenia, correct?
Correct.
The sources of history, were those sources the reports provided to you by defense counsel?
Yes.
And you didn't personally interview the defendant yourself, correct?
I did not.
And so you're relying solely on that
On
information?
reports, correct.
Did you perform the test, or was the test performed in your facility?
No, the test was not performed in my facility. The scans were sent to me.
But it is typical for you to rely on someone else's work.
Yes.
Now, as it relates to the history and looking at the scans, if you look at someone's scan just by itself in a vacuum, so to speak, you can tell that there may be, as you termed, abnormalities.
Correct.
But you can't explain what those are, correct? Or why they're there.
Well, sometimes it depends.
Okay.
So like I said, certain ones have certain patterns. So if you were completely in a black box, you might be able to say, this looks like somebody who has depression, or this looks like somebody who has, obsessive compulsive disorder or somebody who has Alzheimer's disease. And then because of the areas of the brain that might be involved, for example, if somebody's frontal lobes are not working well, you can say this person is most likely having problems with what their frontal lobes help them with, so their executive functions. But ultimately, you need to link it up to the patient, if that's your question.
That is. And so the history of the patient provides context to what you see.
Correct.
Is that correct? Thank you. Now, in the technique section, which you went through in your direct examination, it compares the patient scan to a normative database of PET scans from a group of age-matched healthy controls, correct?
Correct.
What is a norm?
That's the database that comes, it's kind of built into the software, so to speak. So the software company used approximately 40 scans of otherwise healthy individuals, so, not on any medications, not any neurological conditions, no psychiatric conditions, so, otherwise healthy people from a broad range of ages, and then so they develop an average value for all of those brains, and a kind of a range of values that people can be within. And then when you put your scan in to do the analysis, it compares that scan to the overall database, and then you can ask it to look for people who are in that range, because you don't want to be comparing a 40-year-old to a group of 80-year-olds, for example. So you try to at least get that level of comparison, and so that's basically how the software works. And then it basically produces the table with the different areas that are done, and you are able to then see where the abnormalities are.
Okay. Now, you said that the healthy individual, not on medications, otherwise healthy, there's no psychological issues. What about, are any of those individuals in the normative database have substance abuse issues?
No.
Now, age match, and I understand what you said just a moment ago, does gender play a role in your analysis?
For what we were using, we don't differentiate. When we look at, it kind of gets back to the point I was making a little bit earlier, that if you look at large groups of males and females, you can find differences within those groups, but usually they are relatively subtle. And so that's part of why, even though we're comparing to both males and females as part of the normal database, we're waiting for values that are significantly outside of the normal range, even beyond what would be for gender-related issues.
Is it so this standard deviation of 1.65 is based on completely healthy individuals?
Yes.
And is there any sort of database that would compare the defendant scans to people with his history? We'll put it that way. Is there any sort of way to compare it to that, to how he compares to people with a similar history?
I mean, to my knowledge, there isn't a specific, software or standardized way of doing that. You're talking about comparing somebody who's had, for example, head injuries to other people who've had head injuries.
Right.
That doesn't, not to my knowledge.
Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how the scan works. You said there's a radioactive sugar, correct?
Right.
And the scans measure uptake, metabolism,
Yes.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Do you have a known rate that you would expect the liquid, I'm not really sure what the proper term is,
Sure.
but to be absorbed in the brain and start being activated where you can use it in the scan?
I'm not sure.
Now, keep in mind, I'm asking,
I know.
trying to ask an intelligent question when I know nothing about this.
Well, let me try to answer it this way. So the tracer is radioactive to begin with, and once you inject it, it starts to circulate. It gets into your bloodstream, and so your brain, as well as every cell in your body that needs sugar, starts to take it up into the brain. And usually it takes it up over a period. In the case of the brain, it takes about 15 or 20 minutes, so we do this in a resting state. Or you can do it in different states if you want to, but these are typically done as a resting state. And then once the tracer gets into the brain, one of the interesting things about it, how it works, is that it actually gets kind of locked into the brain. So if I were to inject somebody like right now and then finish the testimony, maybe you went and grabbed a quick lunch and then we put you into the scanner, it would tell me what your brain was doing right now. So it does kind of capture a moment in time, and we use that to look at, like for example, seizure disorders. If somebody's having a seizure, you can't put them in the scanner while they're having a seizure, but you can inject them while they're having the seizure, and then you can put them into the scanner afterwards, and then that shows you where the seizure focus was. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It does, thank you. Thank you. You saved me.
Okay. Try my best.
Now, so based on this, this metabolic rate, what we're seeing in the scan, is it in relation to other areas of the brain?
Yes.
And so, once you receive the information, you said you do a visual inspection of the scans.
Yes.
Is that done on a computer?
Yes.
Let's see here. I think I grabbed the wrong. I left something at the table, doctor, if you can give me 1 second.
Sure.
And so there are guidelines, procedures, if you will, for what you do.
Yes.
And it's pretty standardized across anybody in this specialty of nuclear medicine?
Yes.
Now, let's talk about the history. Did you receive a history from the physician or the technician that performed those scans here?
There was a report that came with them, yes.
And did that include any past or current drug use?
I was aware of as I was analyzing the scans, I was aware of the past drug use, yes.
Okay. And you said you'd taken into consideration any psychiatric issues?
Correct.
Correct. Any strokes, epilepsy, those sorts of things?
Correct.
Were you aware of any medications the defendant was on at the time of the scans?
Yes.
Now, with those scans, are there any particular medications that would, I guess, skew the data that you receive?
Well, most of the medications that he's on he's been on for a long time, and so. And part of why you're taking the medication is to manage a particular issue or condition, so for like an anti-seizure medication. So that being said, actually, in many ways, those medications should theoretically help to normalize the brain. And so once again, when we look at the brain and I'm looking to see where the areas are that are abnormal, the thought I would have is that if these areas are particularly abnormal, then they kind of supersede whatever effects the medications may have. And so, again, while medications can certainly have an effect on the brain, the specific medications and what we know about the findings that we have seem to be outside of the range from what I would feel would be kind of the normal effects of the medications.
Understood. When selecting, it looks like there's a color ramp, so to speak, with the scan. Is that
Yes.
fair to say?
Mm-hmm.
Is there some sort of control on how that should be presented to not be misleading?
Yes, I mean, you try to get it so that you can see each of the regions so that, they present in a, usually we try to quote unquote normalize them, so we're kind of looking at one particular area. We use that to make sure that the overall images are not too intense or not intense enough to see. But that's just for the visual inspection. No matter what I do in terms of manipulating the images, it doesn't change what I'm getting in terms of the quantitation.
Sure.
The quantitation is what it is. It's just a matter of how it gets presented on the screen.
The quantitation is the most meaningful thing.
Yes.
So, and the reason I asked that, would you mind putting up a picture of the scan that you have?
Oh, I can go back.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
The reason I asked that is, so there's the area that you just discussed, like it's on the frontal lobe, where they're on the
Right.
far left with the arrow, correct?
Yes.
There's this really intense light blue. Is that highlighted, or is that what you actually saw?
Well, both. So some of these areas that are identified here are part of how the software identifies areas that are over or underactive. So I actually, I'm not able to manipulate that once the quantitation is placed on it. That's how the software portrays it. So when I actually look at the visual image of the scans, which was actually, I guess, on the last page of my report, that's a little bit more of how I actually visualize the scan. This allows us to see some of the areas that are specifically abnormal. So if that's your question, I guess this is highlighting to some extent where they are. It's how the software does it.
Sure, but it's those colors are designed to draw your attention to abnormalities, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. So is there any sort of sampling of the blood that has to take place in order to make sure that, I guess, close the loop, so to speak, as far as quantitation, to make sure your data is reliable?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but so the standard way of looking at a lot of these scans is to normalize the images towards one particular area of the brain or to the entire brain, which is what the software does. And then what you're getting are the relative values of the different areas of the brain and seeing whether they're abnormal or not. There are other ways of quantifying it to get an absolute measure, as we would say, like how many milligrams of sugar the brain is using, which usually require a much greater level of complexity and requires putting a catheter in a person's artery and doing a lot more. That is not the standard. That's been used in research, but that is not a standard technique clinically.
Okay. What pitfalls or sources of error are that you have to look out for in a scan? In general, we look to see the quality of the scan. The question you were asking a little that I saved you on a little while ago about the injection. I mean, you want to make sure that the injection got in, that there's enough activity that you see on the scans, there isn't too much motion that you can see on the scans. These are some of the basic things that we would look at just to, which are pretty easy to assess visually. Okay. If you wouldn't mind taking down the scan, please. Thank you. Now, different medications will alter the metabolism, correct?
They can, yes.
Okay. In the guidance, does the procedure name any specific medications to watch out for or substances, to your knowledge?
Well, I mean, to some degree, you would like to know about every medication that somebody's taking, and certainly medications that are used for different psychological or psychiatric conditions or neurological conditions are important to know about. There's always an interesting issue about, do you have somebody who's been on a medication for a while stop taking the medication or continue to take it? It depends to a certain extent on what those medications are and how long they've been taking it, what they're taking it for. If somebody needs a seizure medication or else they're going to seize, then you can't stop it. You have to allow them to continue to do it. So it's important to note it. And as I mentioned, you take that into consideration when you're looking at the scan and when you're looking at the findings. So if I felt that there were a lot of very subtle findings that weren't really that substantial, or if they would be areas that would be more specific to a particular medication, then again, I would note that in the scan. I'm looking at areas that seem to be so much beyond what I would expect from the medications that, for example, Mr. Wiggins was on, that they seem to sort of overwhelm or supersede what those findings are.
And were you aware whether the defendant had been continuously taking his prescribed medications up to or the time the scans were completed?
My understanding is that he was taking them.
And so, would you agree that sedatives can alter the metabolic rate or alter the metabolism?
They can. Usually sedatives would cause a depression of activity, a reduction.
And amphetamines?
Well, that depends. For someone who has been Some of the research actually has shown in people who are abstinent from them for periods of time, actually it can sometimes show decreases of activity. In particular, one of the areas, what's called the basal ganglia, which is a very central area, which is where those medications work. But interestingly, he actually had higher activity in that area. So some of the areas that were actually, in fact, since I was looking at the scans and looking at where the areas of abnormality were, I was able to kind of look at whether or not I could explain that away by looking at the different medications that he was on or had taken in the past. And the areas that seem to be involved don't seem to correlate with what we see on the scan. So the scan, to me, again, seems to be something that's different than the effects of the drugs.
And so you're assuming then, at the time of the scan, that the defendant had not taken methamphetamine anytime soon prior to the scan?
That would be, as far as I know, yes.
Antipsychotic medications have an effect?
Yes, they can. And similarly, the amount of effect that has been observed has been reported in the medical literature looking at these scans. While it shows the potential for an effect, it doesn't seem to be either the magnitude that we're seeing here or the areas that seem to be involved. Plus, most of the studies that have been done looking at these drug effects are usually in patients who have something, for example, like you mentioned just now, the antipsychotics, people who have schizophrenia.
Now, in your quantitative analysis, you said that you used the term abnormal based on the statistics that we're dealing with.
Right.
In your report, you in the findings section, the second sentence says the visual and quantitative analysis, see table below, reveals areas of mild to moderately decreased metabolism, and then goes on to say there is mild to moderately increased metabolism.
Correct.
And so with that, are you saying that if there's mild to moderate increases or decreases in metabolism, that automatically makes it abnormal?
Yes. In this particular context, so, and what this means that it is, right, it's mildly abnormal, meaning that there's going to be this natural range of variability. So, if he has an area that is just a little bit increased above normal, I'm not counting that as abnormal in the first place. So anything that is above the 1.65, which is beyond that, then that becomes one abnormal, and then we start to talk about exactly to what extent it is abnormal.
It brings me to a question: is you have a normative database, but is there such thing as the perfect brain?
Well, no, and that's why you have a normal range of variation. So we know that some people's brains are going to be a little overactive in certain areas. Some people's brains are going to be a little underactive within, and not to go into the standard deviation, but let's go into percentages, which might be a little bit more simplistic to understand. Is that there's maybe a 10% variation naturally. So some people may have 5% over, some people may have 5% under, and now you're talking about somebody who's got 20% over or under. So whatever natural variation that we're seeing, that's what we're talking about. And so the quote-unquote normal brain would be somebody who pretty much all of the areas of the brain are just within that normal range.
And so would you expect to see, or could you see, someone with a statistically abnormal brain who appears or presents to function completely normally in society?
Usually when I have seen abnormalities in a person's brain, they correlate with some kind. Personally, I don't know if I've ever seen a person who has a wildly abnormal brain and be a completely normal person. When you say function in society, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but normally when I have seen people's brains, they are coming in because they have symptoms, and they appear to be, they have the abnormal brain that correlates with the symptoms that they have. When we have control individuals, when we have healthy individuals who are part of a study, their brains usually look normal. So I guess that's my answer.
Thank you. Now, you said wildly abnormal just a minute ago, but with the defendant, we're dealing with mild to moderate.
Well, again, I just
want to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
I'm sorry. Just to clarify, yes. I have seen. We are doing a study, for example, in concussion patients who have post-concussive symptoms, and all of them pretty much have abnormal brain functions, mild to moderate, sometimes more, and almost all of them have some kind of symptom, which is part of why they're participating in the study.
So, what would you characterize as an abnormal social interaction?
I'm not really sure how to answer.
Okay. Well, so in your report, at the bottom of the first page, speaking of the decreased activity in the parahippocampus, and you're going to have to pronounce the next word for me.
Oh, and amygdala?
Thank you. Is associated with abnormal emotional reactions, including excessive fear, anxiety, or aggression. Abnormalities, particularly in the parahippocampus, have also been implicated in abnormal processing of environmental stimuli, such as visualizing places, and also abnormal social interactions.
Okay. So what I mean by that is that that they are unable to understand other people's emotions properly, that they may not be able to form good relationships with individuals. They may not be able to respond or react properly, and depending on how people ultimately define those terms in a given research study, there's different ways of kind of looking at a person's social interactions, their eye contact, visual body cues, and so forth. So there's a variety of different ways, and that's what I was implying by that. So I'm sorry, when you asked the question, it kind of came out of nowhere, so I wasn't sure what you meant by that. But that's what we're talking about, that they're just not able to read people properly. They're not able to speak with individuals in a kind of a normal setting and be able to go back and forth appropriately. It could be anger-related issues. Somebody says something that really wasn't that problematic, and then they get very upset or very agitated or angry, and then usually that leads to an inability to have good relationships with people.
In the next paragraph, it talks about decreased activity in the frontal regions are associated with abnormal executive functioning, decreased ability to concentrate, decreased ability to regulate emotional reactions, and poor impulse control. Doctor, what would you consider to be abnormal executive functioning?
So executive functioning refers to the ability to basically, when we talk about executive functions, we're talking about the ability to plan your day, to be able to make decisions about what to do, keeping your checkbook, when you're driving, trying to, when you don't have the GPS, trying to figure out your way around. So it's all the ways in which we kind of use our mind, use our cognitive processes to sort of control our lives and plan what we're doing for a given day. So when somebody does not have good executive functions, they're not able to plan things well. They may have abnormal planning, or they may make wrong, a lot of wrong decisions in terms of what to do or when to do it or how to do it. So those would be the kind of things. And it includes concentration and the ability to kind of focus on a given task at hand. So if you're trying to solve a problem at work, if you're trying to find your way when you're lost, not being able to figure out how to resolve that would be the kind of changes or the kind of effects that we'd be talking about.
Would you agree that high stress situations can have an impact on executive functioning?
Yes.
And so if someone's in a high stress situation, you would not expect someone with findings such as these to be able to perform satisfactorily in a high stress situation. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So usually when you have stress, that can actually impair frontal lobe function. So if you already have a frontal lobe that isn't working properly, then you're not able to resolve stressful situations properly.
And so, I guess, give me some examples of what you would consider a high stress situation. Just off the top of your head.
Where I am right now.
Good one.
It could be getting confronted by somebody. It could be something at work that you're dealing with, where there's a problem and you're trying to resolve it. those would be the kind of stressful situations that you might have.
Working with someone, for example, and they start having a heart attack.
Sure.
It's very high stress.
Yeah.
And you would not expect someone with abnormal executive functioning to be able to perform satisfactorily in that situation.
Correct.
Let's see. You make a note in the third full paragraph. It's actually just a sentence that says decreased function in temporal lobe structures is associated with reduced cognition, including memory and language processing. What is memory and language processing?
So basically, the temporal lobes are very involved in our memory and language. So what we mean by that is when it comes to language processing, we're talking about being able to express oneself, being able to understand what somebody is asking for us. When you talk about language itself, there's receiving what somebody says and then thinking about what your answer is going to be and then expressing it back outward in an appropriate way. So sometimes when people have abnormalities in the temporal lobes, they're not able to do that kind of level of processing. Another aspect of that, which also is tied into some of the emotional elements that we were talking about, is not necessarily being able to note in the inflection that somebody may have. So my go-to is, somebody says, "Oh, get out of here." Sometimes they mean get out of here and they're angry, or sometimes they're kind of joking around with you, and your ability to use your temporal lobes and the emotional areas help to assess that so that you're able to work out those social interactions properly. So that's what's meant by the language processing piece. And then memory is just the ability to remember names, to remember what you're supposed to do, to remember whatever specific issues or things that are going on in your life, and it could be even something simple like remembering where your keys are, or remembering to turn the lights off or turn off the stove or whatever. And obviously, when people who have things like dementia, when those temporal lobes get involved, then that becomes very, very serious in terms of affecting them that way.
And so with language processing, someone who has more of a disability with language processing, so to speak, do they have a trouble simply answering the simplest of questions, such as, "Are you wearing a suit today?" Would they have trouble answering that question? On the extreme end.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say exactly, what level of impairment somebody would have. It could be, if it's something that basic, maybe not, but it's hard to know. But usually it has to do more with, again, kind of the more complex interactions that we have, or finding words that you want to say in response to somebody, getting flustered, that kind of thing. So those would be the kind of things that we're talking about.
Doctor, is it easier to respond with a truthful answer than it is to respond with something that's a lie?
Are you asking, you mean?
Does it require more
brain activity?
Language processing skills to be able to tell a lie?
I have to be honest, I'm not really familiar with the literature on that, so I'm not really sure. I know people have studied that, and it is, there's issues about when we're presented with opposing ideas that we have to use more of our brain, but I don't know if that means that it's technically harder or not. I don't really know.
But would you agree that you do have to think, if you're purposefully lying to somebody, would you agree that you have to really think about what you're saying in order to get that out?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, one of the aspects that happens when, for example, the frontal lobes aren't working properly, the frontal lobes are involved in the production of language, and so that is a bit of why, and so we're talking about the emotional areas of the brain and the frontal lobes, and they do kind of balance each other. So like I said, when somebody cuts you off, your emotions go up, and then the frontal lobes help to balance you out. But that's also why when your emotions really kick in and your frontal lobes get shut down, that's why we, when we're angry, we say things that, without thinking, so to speak. So I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question, but I would think that, when somebody is in a highly stressed situation, that it's certainly, especially when the frontal lobe isn't working properly, that they don't, it may be actually that part of the problem is that they're not thinking. And that, whatever's coming out is just kind of coming out without their ability to regulate it properly.
Would you agree that high-stress situations have an effect on your memory?
Yes.
Would you expect someone with a decreased function in their temporal lobe structures to be able to remember very specific details during a high-stress situation?
Well, that depends. Part of the issue with stress, our brains are designed, and the amygdala that we were talking about as being abnormal, that is particularly involved in the emotions that we have. And while we usually think about memory as being something that's cognitive, it's actually very driven by our memories, and that makes sense because we want to remember the important things in our lives, both good and bad. We remember, our wedding day. We remember when something, bad happened to us, when somebody died that we cared about, or something like that. So those actually become more deeply written into our brain than, a lot of the other memories that we may have throughout our lives. So again, I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question the right way, but to me, part of what I would be thinking is that while there could be memory lapses for an individual, while when you're under chronic high stress, that ultimately can diminish your memory. It's sort of like the PTSD kind of thing where those high stress situations, those specific memories can sometimes be particularly heightened in that regard.
The next sentence you talk about abnormal function in the lingual gyrus is associated with decreased visual processing as well as logical reasoning. What is visual processing?
So visual processing has to do with how we perceive the world visually in front of us. Again, part of that has to do, when you're talking about things like socially, you're talking about, can I read your facial expressions? If you smile, do I think that that's being aggressive? Do I think that's being kind? So that's part of what we're talking about, visual processing. And visual processing, again, on a kind of neuropsychological level, can be measured in a lot of different ways, which can involve how we reach for objects in the world around us, how we see different things. But it has to do with just the ability to kind of look out on the world and be able to see it accurately, to see it correctly, and to be able ultimately to respond to those visual images in an appropriate way.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, someone with decreased visual processing, for example, would not be able to see, or when they saw a sheriff's deputy car pulling toward them, they wouldn't necessarily be able to process that that was a sheriff's deputy car. Or they'd have a decreased ability to potentially see that and process it.
I'm not sure. I mean, it's that level. I mean, if you're saying that they wouldn't actually know that it was like a car, or wouldn't know that, be able to identify it that way, I don't know if this level of functioning would result in that. I mean, abnormalities in the brain can ultimately, if they're substantial enough, they can. Whether or not in this case that was what was going on, that I don't know. But I'm really more referring to kind of, how one begins to assess what's going on around you and how you're looking at a particular situation. So you're getting very specific. I think it's hard for me to be able to say, well, yeah, this area of abnormality would prevent somebody from being able to identify a car or something like that. I don't know.
But someone that has a mild abnormality likely wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't have trouble processing things in everyday life.
They certainly could, yes.
What do you mean by, in the same sentence, logical reasoning?
That has to do with problem solving. So that would be, if someone who's able to kind of take certain levels, or certain issues or problems that they're facing and try to sort of reason through, well, if I do this, if I say that, what would be the next logical step? What would be the next thing that would happen? Then if that happens, I can do something else. So it has to do with that level of kind of, looking at a problem and trying to use your rational thought processes to figure out either to resolve the problem or to figure out how to resolve it.
And so you're saying you would expect to see a decreased ability to do that, correct? In the last paragraph you have, it says the findings are not typical for schizophrenia, correct?
Correct.
Doctor, why did you specifically say that in this report?
Well, specifically because at least there had been at least one aspect in the reports that I reviewed about a possible diagnosis of schizophrenia. The findings themselves don't really, are not don't make the characteristic pattern for that. So I was just mentioning that didn't seem to be a likely cause of the symptoms. Likely cause of the findings.
Thank you. And so it says, thus, the most likely diagnosis is a history of congenital abnormality that we talked about in the frontal lobe.
Correct.
And which may have resulted in seizures and abnormal function that subsequently resulted in dysregulation of a number of other brain regions involved in executive function, emotional and impulse control, cognitive function, and social function. And that's your overall finding.
Correct.
Correct. I do have a question about the congenital abnormality. Doctor, the area that seems to be a hole, so to speak, in the defendant's brain, would you expect a hole like that, a space like that, to never fill up with any sort of scar tissue or anything of that nature throughout his lifetime?
Yeah, I mean, it often is just filled with fluid, basically. So yes, not that I know of.
See if there's any other questions I have, Doctor. I'll pass the witness.
Let's take our mid-morning recess. We'll be in recess for 15 minutes, but before we leave, just Doctor, if you will stay where you are. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll step out with the bailiff.
Okay.
I didn't want you, I know it was a stressful situation, I just wanted to. All right, there was a question submitted to me by one of the jurors, and I wanted to cover it since we were going to take our break. Go ahead and cover it while they're out of the room. Question is, are the deviations additive? I think that they mean cumulative. Are the deviations additive or cumulative such that abnormalities plus drug use plus medications plus conditions that they are in would result in a significant deviation? That's the question that the juror has requested to be asked. And I think it's a legitimate question, so unless someone has when we return from our mid-morning break, I intend to ask that question of the doctor. So I'm actually giving you a head start on trying to figure out what your answer is going to be. So,
Sounds good, thank you.
all right, we'll be in recess for 15 minutes.
All rise. This court is in recess.